Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jim Taylor, and I am the Vice President of Leadership Initiatives at BoardSource. And I would like to welcome you all to today's webinar on the topic of connecting boards with the communities they serve. It's great to have you with us, and I invite you all to introduce yourselves in the chat by sharing your name, where you're from, and if you would, share your role, whether you are in terms of a staff member or a board member. We'd just like to get a sense of the role or roles, plural, that you play. Before we get started, I just want to offer a few tips for how we'll interact today. All attendees will be muted during the session, so if you have comments during the session, please use the chat box at the bottom of your screen. If you have questions during the session, please submit them in the Q&A box, also at the bottom of your screen, and we'll either address them during the course of our conversation today, or we will address them during the time we've allocated toward the end of the presentation, toward the end of the conversation, for audience Q&A. Now, before I introduce our two terrific panelists who are going to be joining me today in this conversation, I want to provide some preliminary framing for the conversation we're about to have. Here at BoardSource, we've been doing a lot of thinking about who and what the social sector needs to be in order to advance progress in reducing and eventually eliminating the deep and systemic inequities that have existed in our country for generations. At BoardSource, we've been particularly interested in the question of whether nonprofit boards, as they exist today, are equipped to govern the social sector organizations for which they are responsible. Now, it is our belief at BoardSource that the answer to this question, unfortunately, is no. That boards, as they are constituted today, are not currently well positioned to lead us toward a more equitable future as a society. Now, this thinking led our BoardSource CEO, Ann Wallestad, to write a piece called The 4 Principles of Purpose-Driven Board Leadership that captures our thinking about how boards need to change in order to address our society's deep and systemic inequities. The 4 principles of purpose-driven board leadership are the following. Principle 1 is purpose before organization, which means that boards should prioritize the organization's purpose, the reason for which the organization exists, over the organization itself. Principle 2 is respect for the ecosystem, which is an acknowledgement that the organization's actions can positively or negatively impact the surrounding ecosystem. And it's also a commitment to being a respectful and responsible ecosystem player. Now, all 4 of the principles are mutually reinforcing and interdependent, but it's actually principles 3 and 4 that are at the heart of today's conversation. Principle 3 is equity mindset, which is a commitment to advancing equitable outcomes, and it actively interrogating and avoiding ways in which the organization's strategies and work might actually reinforce systemic inequities. And principle 4 is authorized voice and power, recognizing that organizational power and voice must be authorized by those impacted by the organization's work. And when boards are populated in a way that disconnects them from the communities that their organizations exist to serve, it signals that the organization is not in true partnership with the community it seeks to serve. Boards have a responsibility to engage with those they seek to serve in a way that ensures that organizational decisions are made within the context of truly understanding the community's needs, aspirations, assets, and preferences. Now at BoardSource, we've been having conversations about purpose-driven board leadership with social sector leaders around the country for about the last 6 months, since Ann's piece on purpose-driven board leadership was published in the Stanford Social Innovation Review back in March of this year. And very often when we have these conversations with social sector leaders, the initial reaction is, we would love to get engaged, but where do we start? How do we even begin to address this? But we believe that the act of listening is a great place to start. And now I want to introduce the leaders of 2 organizations that really live into these values of equity mindset and authorized voice and power by the ways in which they focus on the importance of listening as a strategy and as a way of connecting boards and organizations to the communities they seek to serve. Valerie Threlfall is the founding director of Listen4Good. In addition to leading the initial design of the Listen4Good program, she now orchestrates central product and program teams that support more than 575 organizations. Valerie guides Listen4Good strategic direction and is a frequent speaker and author on constituent and client feedback. Her experience in the field goes back 20 years, more than 20 years. And prior to creating Listen4Good, Valerie ran her own consulting firm, Écoutez, which specialized in the intersection of nonprofit strategy, feedback, and performance measurement. She was also the founding director of Youth Truth, a nationally recognized student feedback organization incubated within the Center for Effective Philanthropy. Welcome to you, Valerie. Great to have you with us. And Dan Rhoton is with us as well. Dan is the executive director of Hopeworks Camden and has been working with youth for the past 2 decades in a variety of capacities, working as a teacher, school administrator, and organizational leader. Over the years, Dan has been recognized numerous times for his work with young people, including receiving a Meritorious Service Award from the Pennsylvania House of Representatives and the Campbell Soup Foundation's Seek the Power of Different Award. He was also honored to be named one of the Aspen Institute's 2019 Health Scholars and a 2020 South Jersey Executive of the Year. At Hopeworks, Dan is responsible for the overall implementation of the learning culture of Hopeworks throughout the entire Hopeworks organization, managing all program aspects of Hopeworks and corresponding staff, including Hopeworks training program, residents, and social enterprises. Welcome to you, Dan. Great to see you today. So it is wonderful to see you both. And to kick off our conversation, I want to go over to you, Valerie. I'd like to invite you to share for a few minutes with us an overview of Listen4Good and how your program works and some of the results you've seen thus far regarding how a focus on listening and providing feedback to communities being served has enhanced programmatic and organizational effectiveness. So Valerie, over to you.
Great, thank you so much. Thanks everybody for joining. I'm excited to see a number of familiar faces and names on the chat. So I'm confident we're going to have an interesting conversation today. So given the wealth of experience on this call. So as Jim said, we wanted to provide just a little bit of framing about listening, and some of you I know on the phone have participated in Listen4Good, but for those who have not, Listen4Good is a capacity building program that is focused on social sector organizations and really helping them to increase impact by building what we call high quality feedback practices focused on clients and the community members that are being served by organizations. Our belief is by doing this, organizations build sustainable listening cultures that really allow them to transform how they do their work in the long term. We've worked with more than 575 organizations around the country to date. And just quickly, how we support organizations is really through a variety of tools. We have customized one-on-one coaching. So we partner with organizations for sustained periods of time. At this point, our program model is an 18-month program model where we partner with organizations and help them figure out how to consistently gather, integrate, and really use the feedback from the community and the people that they serve to inform organizational decision-making. I'm thrilled to have this conversation because, Jim, as you've noted, we hear in our work all the time the need for leadership to really set the tone for an organization about why they need to be connected to community. And obviously the board is just, smack in the center of that. So excited to probe that today. And so just to begin with a little bit of grounding, why is it important to listen? Just to frame it up and remind us all sort of purpose first. There's one of the ways that we talk about it is that sometimes that listening and engaging with community is both the right thing to do and the smart thing to do. It's a sign of respect, I believe, to the people attending programs to listen to their perspectives. I think it's really only in our sector that end clients and users of services, because they're not paying, don't get to share what's working and not working from their perspective. It's a unique dynamic that we have in our sector. And at the same time, therefore, funders and I think sometimes providers are the ones getting to provide input into program design, but they lack the context, right? They often can't. There are a lot of blind spots and people lack context and also don't always know what's right. And so the need to listen is important for that reason as well. I think also just more from a sort of pragmatic and sort of, is it the smart thing to do? I think one way we think about the theory of change of listening is that if you're listening to clients and community members, you're engaging them and you're making sure that the experience is a positive one, which actually leads to consistent engagement, which leads to sort of higher outcomes. So what's shown here on the slide is the flip of that. But basically, if people aren't having positive experience, they disengage, which ends up leading to worse outcomes. So there's also, from an impact perspective, I think there's a pragmatic reason to also listen in that regard. But finally, through listening, it's really that we have an opportunity to shift and share power. And as you all have described at BoardSource, listening is also moving that center of gravity, right, from the organization itself to really thinking about the broader stewardship. So listening, I believe, has to happen across the whole system, from the funders to the funders listening to nonprofits, nonprofits listening to community and clients, and then funders engaging also with community, but that's sort of a separate conversation. But the question today is obviously sort of, what's this mean for the board, right? Where is the board in all of this? Before diving into that, I just want to highlight sort of our lens on listening. Listening is a very broad concept, and it means a lot of things. And what we have mostly focused our work on is the concept of feedback, which is the practice of gathering perspectives and feelings from individuals about their experiences with an organization. We can talk more in Q&A about how that's different than maybe prospective listening you may do up front, but that's really where we have focused, is sort of getting feedback from clients about their experience and using that to transform organizational decision-making. As you noted, Jem, your research has shown maybe boards aren't listening. And I think when we look at the field, I think we find that there's also not the greatest listening practices happening across the field. And I think a lot of that is structural, in my opinion. So as a field, I think we have often framed that we gather feedback for somebody else. And when I say we, I mean nonprofits. So we're gathering feedback for funders, we're gathering it for evaluators, but we're not often positioning organizations as the key center users of the information that they gather. And so our belief is that to be high quality and to be useful, it's important to rethink how you think about a feedback and listening, and not as an extractive exercise, but really as a loop. This is one of our principles of our design, and that it's important to think about feedback as a process that is centered with the organization at the middle as sort of a primary consumer of that information. Ideally, that's in partnership with the people who provided it. But it's really also about not collecting feedback just to ship it out the door to other people for use, but really using it internally. And at Listen4Good, we think about a high quality feedback loop as having 5 steps. And what's shown here are sort of the 5 steps of our core model, which is that you have to think about designing a listening or feedback practice. You have to think about how you then collect that feedback. You then have to interpret feedback with an equity lens. And then this back half of the loop is really about doing something with the information and the listening that you learn, or the information that you hear. So it's about doing something different and then engaging in a process that we call closing the loop, which is about sharing back with community what you heard and what you're doing in response. I think if one's going to bring an even stronger equity frame to the work, there's a couple of things that you really need to emphasize in thinking about listening, and if you're going to listen equitably. So a couple of those principles, just very quickly, are to think about accessibility. And I take a very broad view here on accessibility. It's about making sure people can provide you're making it easy for them to provide input. Also that you're thinking about the messaging and the framing of how you're listening. So it's a broad concept. It's also important to look at sort of data at the margins. So when you think about interpreting listening and pulling in what you're listening, where are you emphasizing? Whose voices are you elevating and really amplifying? Finally, it's about creating an environment that actually creates the space to challenge traditional power and challenge traditional notions of sort of who knows what's right, and really create an environment where you can listen and ask questions and really embrace those concepts of humility and curiosity. And then finally, it's about engaging clients as co-collaborators in the feedback loop. So there's an opportunity to make sure that the process of listening is really an inclusive process. And in the case of feedback, that you're engaging clients to really help shape how that feedback exercise goes. Just quickly, what have we seen from when organizations build systematic feedback practices and listening practices? We really see it drive change at 2 levels. So we see that by doing this practice, it leads to changes in programmatic decisions. So that can be in how programs are designed, what programs are offered. And I think we'll hear from Dan a little bit about how they did this and what it meant for them. And in the case of Listen4Good, I would say 81% of organizations make changes in at the programmatic level within 1 year of participating in Listen4Good and building that feedback and listening muscle. But we've also seen it really, if you build in feedback practices or listening practices, it really does catalyze changes at the organization level as well. Sometimes this is about how decisions are made and the use of data. But what it also can do is really spark a broader conversation, to your point about power and how whose voices are represented at the various organizational decision-making tables. And so just to close, I want to highlight one way we think about this is this idea of a client engagement pyramid, and that organizations can have a strong feedback practice at the bottom of, and it really provides a foundation of a broader engagement strategy. But that it's important over time to also think about building other structures that engage clients in consistent shared decision-making roles and shifting power to clients, whether that's through clients' advisory structures or having clients become part of staff or even part of the governance structure, right? So sort of that representative approach. But I just want to highlight that I actually think to really be a sustained listening culture, you need both. You need both these representative approaches at the top of this pyramid, but you also need a strong feedback practice to make sure that you're staying responsive and attuned to the views of many in collaboration with those who may be participating more deeply in some of these other structures. And so just quickly, a quick story just to highlight how one organization did that. We worked with an organization called Compass Working Capital in 2018. Compass had a fledgling feedback system, but wasn't implemented systematically. And so they used Listen4Good as a way to really deepen their practice and increase the rigor of their system. And in particular, in their case, they focused really on barriers. So really trying to make sure that they understood the barriers to accessing their programs. But through the implementation of a feedback practice, what they heard from clients was that they were very interested in developing more regular feedback channels and opportunities to provide input. And so they created a client advisory board coming out of this as a second opportunity for listening and a second forum for listening. And that group turned out to be incredibly pivotal during COVID, for example, as the organization was making rapid shifts in programs. It was really important, and the advisory group, really helped steer both what they were offering and how they were offering services. So it's an opportunity to really listen at multiple levels. So with that, I know we're on a tight time, so I will open it up and to a broader conversation.
Thank you so much, Valerie. You shared so much valuable information there. I particularly noted what you had to say about the things that organizations should do to really emphasize equity as it relates to accessibility and making sure that we focus on data at the margins, challenging traditional power, clients as co-collaborators. All of those things really speak to that equity sort of focus. One of the things I mentioned earlier was that listening can be such a core starting place for becoming a purpose-driven board. Valerie, to you first, how do you see this happening in your work? And what happens to organizations that listen well, from your perspective, Valerie?
Yeah, I think, so how I read your question is sort of like mechanistically, how does this change? Like, how does this change happen? And I think Dan can really bring this alive also in his experience. But I think what it is, and you all Anne alludes to this in the paper that you all put out in the article in SSIR, but listening, I think, really does just create a tone of humility and curiosity. And I think it suggests that people in positional power do not have it opens up and affirms that people in positional power do not have the answers. And I think that in that sense, it changes cultures. But I think what a feedback practice can do, as I think about it, is it's about really honing that muscle and making it into a sort of systematic practice. So that it's not one-off, so that it's something that you do ongoing. And a favorite quote of mine is actually one of our former co-chairs of the Fund for Shared Insight, Kelly Gully. She often says that you must listen deep enough to be changed by what you hear. And I think that is really emblematic of sort of how you can listen deeply and how it can manifest in organizations.
Yeah, that's a wonderful quote. Listen deeply enough to be changed by what you hear. That's one that I'll certainly remember. And
I agree. Yeah.
And I also appreciate what you said about thinking of feedback and listening as a muscle that you build, the muscle you have to exercise so that you can get better and better at it. So I think that's a great analogy as well. Dan, I want to bring you into the conversation because I know you have participated in Listen4Good to strengthen your feedback practices at Hopeworks. Can you give us a summary of Hopeworks and the work that it does, and why you participated, why you chose to participate in Listen4Good, and what you learned?
Oh, absolutely. Great to be on the call today. I'm really excited to chat about it. So first, what is Hopeworks? Fundamentally, what we do at Hopeworks, we work with young people 17 to 27. When one of our participants walk in the front door, 99% of them are unemployed. The average annual wage is just under $400. Folks aren't making any money. When they walk out the door, 9 to 12 months later, average starting salary is just under $42,000 per year, and 89% of them are still working 12 months later. We feel great about that, right? And how we do it, right, is we train them in technology, front-end web development, geographic information systems, data visualization. While they're training with us, we help them build career, professional, and use a trauma-informed approach to build social and emotional skills. Now, by the time they're done with training, right, they have great technical skills, they have great professional skills, but especially since we work with overwhelmingly brown and Black young people, they lack experience. And they need that experience to break into a market that often is not welcoming to young people who are the first or the only in a company. To give them that experience, we hire them. Hopeworks runs 3 social enterprises, 3 revenue-generating businesses where we provide outsourced web development, data visualization, and GIS services, as well as training and consulting to nonprofits on our trauma-informed approach to companies all over the country, as big as Comcast and American Water, and as small as mid-sized infrastructure companies. So that's what we do, right, at Hopeworks. And I gotta say, it's super fun. And you can imagine, this is why Listen4Good was so important, because listen, we're generating a lot of new wealth. Young people are making money, they're getting jobs, it's really exciting. You watch the news, right? Companies need talent. This is the moment, right? This is the moment we think to dramatically grow our impact, to really get young people into positions they might not otherwise get into and show the economic impact of employing young people based on their skills and qualifications rather than their access to privilege, right? This is the thing. And we got a logic model, and we got graphs, and we got charts, and we got like compelling stories, and we're ready to go. But you know why we did Listen4Good? There was a little voice for all of us as we looked at our charts and our fancy theories of change that said, what if you're wrong? Right? What if you scale to 2x, 3x, 4x, which is what we're working on? And what if our underlying assumptions that Valerie said, people in positions of power, right, like me, folks who look like me, declare so confidently, what if we're wrong, right? And we needed to find out. So we did. We did the Listen4Good process. We started getting feedback. We were very thoughtful of our design. And let me tell you what we learned first. Now, first, good news, right? A lot of the things we believed we were right? The atmosphere, the trauma-informed approach, employers, all that stuff. Good. But turns out we were wrong in some critical places. 2 quick examples, for example, right? One of the things that you look at is, you always look at the folks that are successful, the 80%, 88% retention rate, but you always wonder about that 12% that aren't, right? Or you always wonder about the folks who don't retain. But it's okay, because Jim, I'm sure you and Valerie have talked to many nonprofits. We had explanations for days about why folks didn't retain, right? I had theories about poverty and access and transportation And I had all these very smart sounding ideas, often given to me by very smart people. None of them were right. Not a single one of them were right. What we found out is by using this feedback loop to really listen to young people who did not retain all the way through the training program, what we learned is it was none of those things. It stings a little bit to say it because, man, I felt so smart. But turns out the way our stipend structure, young people work for us and get paid wages, but they get stipends as they train with us. Turns out the way the stipend structure was you got paid for finishing units, right? For young people that were not as confident about their ability to finish unit on time, that meant that the income we were providing them could feel highly unpredictable. Right, it's obvious when you right now, right? And we would lose them to 2-week jobs at Amazon, 1-week job at Burger King. They wouldn't work out, right? They'd end up unemployed again, but it would feel safer for that moment. And I got to tell you, that's just one example. Jim and Valerie, I know you guys are probably nodding your head, but like not a single smart person made that connection. But when we asked, we did. And here's the payoff is just in the, so of course we changed it, obviously, like that's the moral story. Like, Valerie said within a year, we changed it within like 17 days of getting that data, right? Like it was clear. We made the changes. Retention jumped, especially amongst the folks we were saying, well, what can you do, right? Turns out you can do a lot if you ask the right question, right? And then even more importantly, what the other thing is as we're doing all this growth, we're working with our board and we shared that information with our board and it was great information and we made better decisions, but what else it did? It fundamentally changed some of the conversations we had with our board. We have a great board. We have an awesome team. But oftentimes my experience is when someone in my position, executive director, is talking to a board or when a board is talking to somebody like me, the word you hear a lot is convince, right? I'm going to convince our board to make this investment. Our board is going to convince me to hire this person, right? Or make this change. And it really becomes about who wins rather than results, right?
Right.
Now, with Listen4Good, because not only do we get that data now, but you guys know the motto, every 6 months or so, you're getting that same feedback. So now what we're able to do is the conversation at the board level isn't me trying to sell something or me trying to avoid being sold something. We have some good salespeople on that board, right? Instead, it's, listen, our net promoter score last cycle was 70. How can we keep it that high, right? Listen, 80% of our participants said this. But what about those 12%? I think if we tried this, we might be able to get that up another 8 points. And then we're talking about the data, we're talking about the experiment, and then 6 months later, we're talking about the results of that data. The only winners or losers then are the participants who are getting better service. And that, I think, for us is kind of who we are, why we did it now, although we should have done it forever ago, right? And like how we're using it, that is really helping us scale, but also do it in a way that really tells us that we're doing it the right way.
Thank you, Dan. That's a great story, great narrative you've shared. And you shared so much there. And one of the things that really resonated with me was the question you asked in terms of what if we're wrong? What a great question that is for boards, for organizations and boards to reflect on. What if we're wrong? One of the ways we talk about it at BoardSource sometimes is, how do we know what we know? How do we know what we think we know? Almost to just sort of check ourselves, asking organizations to check themselves in terms of how they know what they know. And by extension, when we talk to organizations around diversity, inclusion, and equity, as one example, one of the things we ask boards to think about is whether or not they're bringing the perspectives of the community into their boardroom deliberations and discussions. Are they ever at risk of making decisions without knowing what it is the community might want? So I think your question of what if we're wrong is such a healthy question to ask, and to ask periodically. Don't just ask once, but kind of keep asking. Boards should keep asking themselves. So I appreciate that very much. Dan, one of the things that Valerie shared in her presentation was the client engagement pyramid that runs the range from feedback and to co-creation to ownership as being sort of part of that model of client engagement. How do you see those strategies interacting at Hopeworks?
Well, first, I have to say too, for that pyramid, like the results are real, right? 5 years ago, Hopeworks is a very different organization. Right now, 30% of our permanent staff are alumni of our program, right? And where that comes from, right, is that it's not just, what we find is it's not just asking that gets the engagement. It's, and of course, we learned this from Listen4Good, but it's asking, saying back what you heard, and talking about the changes you're making, right? And what that does is Hopeworks doesn't have to be a place where people come and they get the prescription. They get the dosage of the thing that somebody like me has said you should get, right? It's a community we're building. It's a place we're going. And one of the best things is, and I'm sure Valerie, you've seen it, is I am certain that Valerie and Jim, you guys have much more sophisticated ways of measuring it. But for us, what we measure is when one of our participants is talking about our organization, like, do they say we, do they say us, or do they say Hopeworks, right? Or that place, right? The other thing that we measure is, and this is really important, is over 90% of the young participants who come through our program are referred by another young person. And that's because, listen, I go to Wendy's and I get a great cheeseburger, right? I'm going to bring my friends, right? But that also, it's not just a cheeseburger. This is an experience about changing your life. So it's not just good service, it's trust. Because you're trusting this organization, Hopeworks, with key parts about your life, what's important to you, what you're scared about. So it's not just great customer service. It's not, you're checking out at Best Buy and you'd like to have 5 stars, please, today, right? It is, I trust you with the most intimate and scary parts of my growth, my imposter syndrome, my fear, my hope. And that comes not from a good survey, but from knowing that when you respond to a survey, you're going to be heard, it's going to be responded to, and you can trust folks. And that's kind of how we see the engagement at Hopeworks.
I love those concepts of trust and being heard. I think that really speaks again to equity mindsets and having authorized voice and power. Really bringing the community in a way that's really meaningful. Valerie, thinking about listening and feedback, on the surface, they might seem like such simple concepts, but really it seems that there's much more involved there than might appear at first glance.
Yeah.
Are there any best practices or key approaches that you would share that organizations should keep in mind as they think about listening and feedback practices?
I think Dan actually really framed it in terms of, and this concept of trust, like, is so pivotal, and it's not easily earned. And the people who, in the case of what we see with feedback, people are being asked to provide input, and they have been let down by so many systems and so many organizations. And so there is, in my opinion, such rightful cynicism or disbelief that you're really going to care or listen. And so they've been sold a lot of bags of goods that aren't legit, right? So, so I think one of the biggest things, and Dan talked about this, if you're going to ultimately move to a place of trust, and I love your frame, Dan, of like, are they using the we, are they feeling part of the organization? I think to do listening and feedback, you have to think about creating a safe space. And so when I talked about accessibility, it's actually about and this is one of the things that I find people, when they hear about listening and feedback, they're like, oh, so it's about the good questions. We got to have the good questions. We got to have the right links or digital access, or maybe we need to figure out how to deliver it. But actually, it's really a framing and messaging and opportunity to authentically say, I'm going to listen. This is not a test, and this is not a right answer. This is your turn to tell me. This is shifting the tables. This is your turn to tell me as a provider, where I've had traditionally more power and sort of, I have a leg, in the power system. Many of the programs that we work with, the clients are dependent on these programs for food, for a job, for, safety and security. And so I would say the first thing is about really thinking about how can you, and there's a variety of ways to do this, but how can you make choices that make somebody feel that they can really be safe in providing that candid feedback. And so some of that's messaging, some of that's technical choices, some of that's things like anonymity. So one of the things that we encourage is anonymous surveying as a way to acknowledge and try and counter some of those implicit power imbalances at play. But then also, as I think Dan was illustrating too, the second thing I would say is you have to do something with the data. So I encourage organizations, like, don't gather feedback if you're not prepared to do anything with it. So it's about being in a position where you're really going to do something with the feedback. If you can do those two things, you've gone very far, I think, in building a high quality listening practice.
Yeah, wonderful. And Dan, you have shared your feedback with the board, and how did the board react initially? How did this feel to them in terms of just this process? Did they take to it right away, and how did they use that data for their decision making?
Yeah, so I think three really important things happened, right? The first is curiosity. Tell me more about this, which is really important because so often at the board level, we're so busy, both folks in my role, executive directors, and even board members are so busy knowing everything already, right? A moment of curiosity is really important. The second thing that happened that was really, really important was what happened in the conversation with our board members who are alumni of our program. All too often, what can easily happen is board members at Hopeworks who are alumni can sometimes get pigeonholed into, well, what do participants think? And the truth is, Kahlua on our board, Kahlua is awesome, and Kahlua knows what Kahlua thinks, right? But this gave everyone on the board a chance to really get some different perspectives about the huge diversity of views of participants in our program. And I think the third thing, and this is so important, is they changed the conversation from this great idea versus this great idea, which is how often board conversations go. We should do this. No, I think we should do this. To Hopeworks, board and staff versus the data, right? We're going to get that number to 80. How could we do it? Why is it where it's at, right? And that is a fundamentally different kind of conversation. And I got to tell you, it is invigorating.
That's great. Thank you. I want to come back for a moment to what you said about the conversation with board members who are alums of the program. And it makes me think about this whole idea of board members having lived experience that is relevant to the work, and how those who are alums of the program have a real sense of what the program's impact can be for the individuals who are participating in it. And they can give the board, perhaps, if they don't have that experience, just another perspective in terms of the kinds of impact that certain board decisions might make on the program participants. So I love the fact that you all are having those conversations that can lead to more informed decisions, right? More informed conversations, for sure. So what I'd like to do now is just ask both of you to kind of share, starting with you, Dan, what does all of this mean for boards in terms of how would you want to see the board conversations changing as a result of feedback, and what's the board's ideal role in a listening culture from you all's perspectives?
So at Hopeworks, how we really think about it is, so the board has the fiduciary and governance responsibility, short check, right? And at Hopeworks, the way we think about it is, look, if we're going to get 10 or 15 or 20 of the smartest, most accomplished people that we know, including Hopeworks alumni, in a room for 2 hours every other month, we would rather not have them read program reports. Instead, we would like to have them put that massive brain power and experience on the toughest problems facing our organization, right? And what this Listen4Good and this ongoing feedback, where we can see how we're doing on the things that are most important to us, that's the score, right? And one thing I know about high achieving board members is two things. They want to have impact and they like to win. And if we can show them how to run up the score on social impact with our young people, they're going to do it. And that, I think, really is how we can really make this into a really strong board conversation.
Thanks, Dan. Valerie, your perspective?
Yeah, I think, I don't want the message from this session, I don't think it's come through, but to be that boards should go out and go collecting their own community feedback. And then we're not suggesting boards should be the data collection tool. But I do think, as Dan highlighted, they are the primary, they can be, and is there an opportunity to make them the primary consumers of the listening and feedback data that you get and that input. And I think it's interesting that if your organization may not have a leader like Dan, who's sort of bought into the opportunity and the idea of listening to the people that you serve, I actually think it's an interesting idea that the board has a unique role in pushing that conversation, because the board does have a position of privilege, frankly. And so how do you leverage that privilege to, as you were saying, Jim, to be the group that says, well, how do you all know that, and interrogate a bit and push on that, right, with staff and say, did you ask community? Did we consult community when we were making that decision? How did you get that information? And I think that's that's changing, expanding the role of the board to be these thought partners in inquiry and shaping some of that broader organizational decision making. But I think it's a real opportunity that I'd love to see board seize. I mean, I think that would be powerful.
Absolutely, absolutely. We're about to transition into opening up this conversation to our audience. Before we do, and I encourage those who are listening in to input their questions into the Q&A box. But before we do that, I'll just have one more question for both of you all. And that is that in the work that you've both done so far with boards and with organizations, in terms of having boards and organizations listening to and creating feedback loops with communities that they serve, is there anything that's particularly surprised you thus far in terms of the work you've done, in terms of any of the reactions of the organizations? And if so, what would you say has surprised you?
Yeah, I can go first. So, I mean, I think this may sound overly simplistic, but when I was thinking about what it makes me think about is really people want to be asked their opinion, and just how profound it can be to open up this area of inquiry, not only for the organization, but for the clients themselves. And I think I've continually been surprised and disheartened at the same time, but also, when you give people who have not always had an opportunity to give their perspectives, or the systems have not recognized their perspectives, when you just open that up, just how profound that can be for everybody involved. And so I think to then, where it takes me is to start listening, try to start listening in small ways, experiment. And as Dan, as sort of Dan was saying, embrace this curiosity and engage people and say, what do you think? And just how different that can be than kind of going down our lockstep of thinking that boards or organizational leaders have it figured out, and we have to just kind of keep driving down this lane. So.
Thanks, Valerie.
I think the only other thing that I would contribute is once you start this process, in my experience, is how much easier it is to shut up. And what I mean by that is, like, man, I love to talk. You may have noticed, but like, you know what? Nobody wants to hear from me, right? And I am at my worst when I try to speak for someone else. But sometimes there's this big empty space that folks like me feel like we have to fill because there's no voices coming. Well, actually, turns out they're there. I got a survey. I got some information. Here's someone who can talk to you about it, right? And it is so easy for folks like me to be quiet, and that is something that, I don't know is in the brochure, but it has been so helpful for us.
But I think, Jim, that's when I think back to the article and you all talk about like authorized voice and power, that is it, right? That is a demonstration of that principle that you all have talked about. Absolutely. So profoundly. Yeah,
absolutely. That boards and organizations must the organization, boards and organizations, as they make decisions, must be making sure that they're really engaging those who are most impacted by the work. That's really what's about the thing about authorization, is making sure that those who are most impacted by the work would really endorse that and say that, yes, these decisions you're making, these actions you're taking are in our best interests. And boards can only know that, organizations can only know that if they're engaging those individuals who are most impacted. So absolutely, I think that's so true. I see one question we have in the Q&A here. Should nonprofits first have a robust theory of change before implementing client feedback loops? Or can they start Listen4Good without a clear theory of change?
It's a good question. And Tess has, I know Tess Reynolds from the Bay Area. She's run a nonprofit for many, many years here in the Bay Area in a former life. So I don't think you need to. I think as where Dan was indicating, there's an opportunity to use feedback as a way to test assumptions that you have made, and whether that's codified as a theory of change or other tools. But I actually think there's also an opportunity to do kind of open inquiry if you're still earlier in that journey of understanding what is it that's most impactful that we do, what made a difference for you, and starting to surface what those core program elements or core program decisions, what you're doing that's actually having the greatest value. So I think there is an opportunity to do it when you're relatively nascent. And just specifically in Listen4Good's case, we do have some organizations. We have a very broad portfolio. We have organizations that are a couple $100,000 in budget to like hundreds of millions dollars in budget. So obviously very different levels of maturity around the use of data and sort of those kinds of tools like theory of change. And I think for some organizations, there's an opportunity if you're a younger organization or earlier in your development to use feedback as an entree point into some of that broader impact measurement work as a way to rethink what counts and sort of and how do you really want to sort of tell your impact story, and to ground it in the voices and the perspectives, just as we were saying, of the people that you serve very directly.
And, Jim, the only thing I would add to it, I totally agree. And the only other thing I would add to it is, getting feedback and challenging assumptions is scary. In my experiences, when a nonprofit is thinking about doing something scary, there's always another best practice to research, right? There is always another graph to make. And maybe we should just analyze this spreadsheet a little bit more. Does that make sense? So I would say, just do it. It'll be fine, right? And I would say, the results that you get will build a better theory of change, will build a better best practice, whatever the thing is, it's a little scary. You just gotta do it, do the thing, right?
Right.
Yeah.
I want to come back to something that Valerie said earlier, just a few minutes ago, around how people want to be asked their opinions. And Dan, I was wondering, from your perspective in the work you've done thus far with Listen4Good, how much have you found that to be true in terms of when people are being asked their opinions? What sort of reactions have you seen? Have they been surprised to be asked? Have they been flattered to be asked? I'm curious about that side of this in terms of what you've seen when you've asked.
Well, actually, it's interesting. So this is a little bit different for us. Our participants have been asked their opinion bazillions of times and summarily ignored after that. Mm. Everybody wants to know their opinion. They want their survey about this. They want to know this. What's your impression of this? What do you think about this? No, everyone wants their opinion. They just don't want to do anything with it. And so for us, the transformative moment is when we ask the opinion, and then not 12 months later, not 18 months later, not, within 17 days, we said, hey, everybody, we asked, here's what you said, and here's what we're doing differently. Then folks were like, well, this is different. And I mean, they said that explicitly, and then, then let me tell you, because then talk about a safe space. Folks said, listen, I'm being real. I just did it for the stipend because I thought it was going to be like every other time. But this is a thing now, Hopeworks. I'm loving this. And while we're sitting down and chatting, since apparently y'all care, how about I tell you about this other thing, right? And so for me, it was not
Yes.
just the right, Val, you know what I'm saying?
Totally.
Like,
Yeah.
yeah. Oh, yeah. Our participants get surveyed by smart people constantly and never see the results of the research, never get to see anything happen. So for us, it's not just asking, it's like the thing that happens next in short order, right, is important.
I was doing an initial focus group for a Youth Truth, and I watched a young woman answer a survey right in front of me that she was handed. She went straight down the line, circled B's, handed it back, and I was like, that's what I'm countering. That's what we're trying to counter, is she's cynical about providing feedback, and because it hasn't been taken seriously. And so she's not going to do it. But that's the breaking, that's creating the trust. It's suddenly changing the paradigm of what it means to listen.
It's interesting. You both touched on something that relates to the next question I see here, which is what advice would you give a client who wants to start a feedback listening loop that has previously asked for feedback and not acted on it? How do you rebuild that trust? So it sounds like that's really what you're all getting at here in terms of really saying what happened before that's not the way we're going to handle this going forward. We really are going to engage you and use your feedback.
And I think just on that, Jim, I mean, a lot of this, if somebody had a feedback practice, is I think to a little bit to Dan's point, you have to acknowledge we've done this in other vehicles before, and it hasn't sort of yielded, or you have to at least, and that's maybe not the best wording, but you have to acknowledge. And I think really walk the walk though, and you have to demonstrate that you're listening. I do think there's also ways to frame, I would say pragmatically, there's a way to frame the exercise differently so that people feel and see it as something different. So for example, we worked with organizations who sometimes take a program like Listen4Good and they turn it into like a speak up week. So it's an opportunity to sort of change the frame of what you're asking for so that it does feel, and I don't want to say in an inauthentic way, but that it sort of sets the tone that this is something different and this is different than prior efforts. So maybe by messaging around it differently, but ultimately it's about authentically responding to the feedback and doing something with it. You have to be prepared to walk that walk.
And Valerie, when you say speak up week as an example, that's just saying making it a week where you particularly
sort of framing. I think what does happen is people are surveyed a lot about, as part of program compliance or reporting requirements. And so they sort of take these tests, they take these long surveys where they answer lots of questions. That feels very different being handed that kind of survey versus being brought in to something, whether you want to call it a speak up week or use your voice or something that says, this is about engagement. This is about getting an opportunity. So I hate to call it branding, but it's a way to think about how you frame the feedback and input opportunity to honor the values and what you're really trying to achieve. It's important.
Dan, anything you would add there?
I think just to add to that is, I think it is really important to say like the timeline when you're going to collect the data, when you're going to share results, and what you're going to do about it, like at the beginning. Because to Valerie's part, like everybody's been promised, every young person who walks to Hopeworks has been promised that their life is going to be changed like 20 times by the time they come to Hopeworks, right? And it's never panned out. And so like, hey, here's when we're going to do it. Here's when you're going to hear the results. Like schedule that the day you send out the survey. And here's when we're going to make the changes within 15 days of sharing the results. Folks will still be curious if it's going to happen. But like, other than that, Joe got transferred and so got a new job. And so there's a little turnover, and then a year later, and then there you go. Right.
Right. Absolutely. We are coming near the end of our time together, but I do want to, before we close out in a few minutes, I wanted to ask both of you to share your thoughts on, for those who are listening today and want to do more in this space after being inspired by the things you all have shared, what's one sort of next step that you would want boards to take, or what's in some ways the first step that we would want boards to take if they were to decide to engage in Listen4Good and some of the practices you all have talked about today?
Dan, do you want to go?
Yeah, I mean, for me, like the key question that really drove us was that, like, what if you're wrong?
Yeah.
And just like asking staff and board members and your participants, like, what assumptions does HopeWorks make that we're wrong about? Right.
Mhm,
And then when
mhm.
you see the number of things on that list, like, wow, it's time to get going on that feedback, right?
Right.
Because that's the danger, is the thing that's going to sink your organization is not the thing that you were expecting or that you were talking to the board about. The thing that's going to sink you is the thing you were certain was not a problem, right? And so I think that's a great opening to like enter that vulnerable space of like, we don't know, and we might not, but someone else might. We should ask them.
And I think that's where the humility that you talked about, Valerie, as well, really comes in terms of recognizing you don't have all the answers and you might be wrong. And let's just check ourselves to make sure. Valerie, your perspective?
Yeah, I think depending on where you sit within an organization, I think boards, I agree with Dan. It's in the next board meeting, maybe say, like, how do we know, to your point, Jim, how do we know that? Just try it out in a setting and sort of see what the reaction is, or what makes us think that, or are we making an assumption here? Kind of provoke that conversation. And I think if you're a program person and within program or a practitioner in that regard, I would say try it with your next, whether it's an event or whether a program that you're starting to design or you've just rolled out. Like, just start small, do a small feedback experiment and get your feet wet. And even there though, like, try some of these principles of closing the loop or saying something, even it can be a quick email back, here's what we did, or thanks, just closing that loop. But start small and just kind of play around would be the other thing I would say, to start to acquaint yourself with building that muscle and get it going.
Yeah.
So
Thank you both. I think both of what you both shared was really around asking different questions. And I think that's also common to, that is also relates very closely to what we would say around purpose-driven board leadership. Very often we just, when boards ask where to begin, we say, just start, you might want to start small by just asking yourself different kinds of questions, rather than asking yourself, what have we accomplished? Ask, what did we make possible as a result of our commitment to purpose and partnership with others? Instead of asking how do we get more program participants, ask yourself, how do we build relevance and relationships with the communities we seek to serve? These are just different kinds of questions that, again, sort of move the center of gravity away from the organization itself, so specifically, and move it to the purpose for which the organization exists, which I think is really what you all have been talking about and sharing in such an inspiring way over this past hour. Valerie and Dan, I want to thank you both for today's conversation. You and the organizations you lead are doing wonderful, essential work to connect boards and organizations to the communities they seek to serve. And I just appreciate your sharing of guidance and the lessons you've learned with the audience today. And again, for those who would like to learn more about Listen4Good and HopeWorks and the 4 principles of purpose-driven board leadership, I know we have shared the links throughout today in the chat. And I know that Valerie and Dan and I would all welcome the chance to continue to engage beyond just today's conversation. And so with that, thank you again to Valerie, to Dan, and to all of you who have participated today in this conversation. And have a great rest of your day.
thank you so much.
Super fun. Bye, everybody. Feel free to reach out if we can ever help you at HopeWorks. We'd love to hear from you.